Hello, and welcome to the final lecture in the Sociology of Hip Hop. I'll still post something like normal next week, which will be focused more around the reviewing things that we've already talked about throughout this class for the final exam. Today we're going to be covering the last 3 readings that we're going to cover in this class. As we were doing last week, these readings are building on the concepts that we've been using throughout the semester. We're using those concepts to understand how hip-hop culture fits within the social world today. So before we get into the materials that we're going to cover in today's lecture, I just want to back up a moment and talk about the learning objectives for this course. So hopefully this will help you to kind of take a step back and see the big picture kind of learning objectives that we've been working on throughout this semester, so you can evaluate, how deeply you felt like you've engaged with these practices and forms of knowledge. So we'll get into that now. Right, so when we started this class, we set 3 learning objectives. The first one was to become familiar with hip-hop history and the scholarship that has grown up around hip-hop history. To develop your critical media literacy. So for this, you can think about when you're looking at music videos or listening to music. It could be hip-hop, but it could be other genres as well. I hope that this class has given you an understanding as to the commercial forces that are at play and how they shape the culture that we consume and the culture that helps us to form our identities. It's all wrapped up in these larger social processes that are going on. And as we've covered in this class, these can be more grassroots, community-based forces that are shaping the culture that we consume, but we can get that impression while there are important commercial forces that are at play shaping the culture that we're consuming. And so I hope that you've kind of gotten a sense of that, especially when we talk about like how hip-hop has transitioned into a commercial-based genre and a highly profitable musical genre. So I hope that you'll be able to take that insight with you to be able to unpack future manifestations of hip-hop culture that you come across, as well as, genres from a variety of other cultural traditions. We're going to be working towards thinking of that big picture stuff when we get to the article that helps us to theorize, systems of cultural classification. That's what we'll be calling them. So I hope that you can see that there are multiple forces at play in the forms of culture that we consume. And I hope that you've gotten some practice with these sociological research methods that can help us to kind of puzzle through those forces, right? And how those forces play out in creating and shaping the culture that we consume. So I hope that you're taking away some insights from the assignments today you're taking away insights from the assignments that you've completed for this course in terms of the process of content analysis. By doing that twice, I hope that you have gotten a bit more comfortable with it. I hope that you've been able to see how this content analysis method provides us with the tools to wade through very complex and sometimes contradictory beliefs or messages that are conveyed in our culture, in the culture that we consume. So I do know that I've talked with lots of you throughout this process, and I know that starting this content analysis method, you do start from this place of like great confusion, and I hope that by kind of working through these 2 assignments, the one that the early one that gave you a bit more guidance, and then the second one which helped you to hopefully explore something that you wanted to learn more about, or hopefully you did gain some insights through that. But I do hope that you can see that when you're starting from a place of some maybe perhaps pure confusion or extreme confusion, that's the place that you need to start to generate big insights, right? So I hope that you're just a bit more comfortable with sitting in that ambiguity and working through it and then trying to find something to say about it. This is the process of social research. So, whether or not it interests you to go further in that, at least I hope that you have taken away some experience with grappling with these sorts of ambiguity, these forms of ambiguity and contradictions, and seen that content analysis method as a way of dealing with that ambiguity and confusion, and that it is really a process. So again, those were the 3 learning objectives for this course, and I do hope that you feel like you did gain familiarity with hip-hop history and scholarship, that you've been practicing critical media literacy, and that hopefully you can apply that to other forms of culture beyond hip-hop, and that you've just come to understand the type of analytical work that sociologists do, and the kinds of practices that social scientists value in terms of generating knowledge. So that said, let's get into the final 3 readings for this course. Alright, so let's turn now to the first article for this week by Bramwell and Butterworth, 2 very English names, on translocal grime. So if you're unfamiliar with grime as like a musical genre, I'll give you an example shortly. But first I just want to talk about how this article is connected to the concept of translocality that we were talking about last week. So remember when we were talking last week about how hip-hop disseminated across the globe, we used the concept of translocality to show that hip-hop spans localities, and that it traverses across them. So remember that story from another author, her name was Turko Raffi, and she was talking about her experience as a high school student in Greece. And one day a fellow student had been traveling abroad and came back with a different set of outfits and a different form of calligraphy, which she learned was graffiti. And that student brought basically hip-hop culture to the high school, and the students got into it and started to replicate that kind of those aesthetics in their clothing and in the writing as well. So what's important about this story is that this is just one instance of this happening in one city in the world, but this happened all over the world, right? Young people brought hip-hop culture to their peers, who adapted it to their local kind of context, right? So the big thing we were talking about last week was how, given this translocality concept, when hip-hop comes to a new locale, the generally young people, sometimes not though, use that to respond to the political context of their region. And this could be as small as a neighborhood or as wide as like 2 countries, like when we were talking about the in the article from Morgan and Bennett, when they were talking about the Egyptian hip-hop artists and how they supported each other through their music. In this article, we're zooming into a core aspect of translocality, and that is how hip-hop spreads around this local region. So when we talk about translocality, sometimes we're talking about how, there can be a kind of culture that ties together all of these different hip-hop kind of spaces around the globe. But this approach is looking at how hip-hop spreads across one locale. So how does it establish translocality in one space? I can see how that's like a little confusing because these are kind of 2 pretty different ways of using the same word, but at the same time they're getting at a certain process in fine detail, which we were talking about in kind of broad strokes last week. So in this article, they're talking about how translocality becomes established in a small region, whereas last week we were talking about how hip-hop became a kind of global phenomenon. Another kind of story that fits this narrative is somebody named Chili in this article. And he was talking about when he was in high school, or what they would call secondary school, he got really into hip-hop early on, even though the students around him were into grime. And then he tells me that, or he doesn't tell me, he tells the authors that after a while, you know, he became to be more of a grime artist than a hip-hop artist. And so this shows the way that, you know, you could be drawn to this general kind of hip-hop culture, but the local context plays a really important way in the kind of ultimate hip-hop culture that shapes your behaviors. So to give you a sense as to what this grime music is, you know, the authors in this article are talking about grime as a form of hip-hop culture, or a form of music that includes rapping. If you look into grime and do a bit of research, it's a bit controversial to call grime hip-hop. Some people are trying to say that it's not a subgenre of hip-hop, it's its own genre, which may or may not have some hip-hop elements, which is fine. But for this case, we're going to, the authors of the article talk about it as if it's, they do talk about it as if it's a subgenre of hip-hop. But if we want to be specific about it, I think it's worth saying that grime incorporates important elements of hip-hop culture, especially MCing. The people who are performing are rapping. They're typically posturing in a sort of like hyper masculinist, or they're kind of using hyper masculinity. Sorry, let me say that again. Hyper masculinity is an important aspect of their artistic identity, like a lot of hip-hop artists. Something that's really important, though, about what helps grime to stand apart is that it does draw from more musical influences than kind of like what classic hip-hop would draw from in terms of just like sampling records. So it, or like popular records, and it draws from a variety of musical cultures that are kind of special to the UK's culture, in terms of the different groups that have immigrated there. And the other important thing here, linking this back to Jennifer Lena's work when she's talking about all of the different aspects of genre, one big thing that sets grime apart is the use of UK argot. And argot is just a fancy way of saying like their style of speaking, their slang, things like that. So before we get into the kind of nitty-gritty of their theory of translocality, how this works, how grime operates in London and Bristol, and the social research methods and all that they use to kind of come up with that theory, I'm going to share a clip I'll share a music video from, I do believe it's one of the artists who appears in the article, so that you can get a sense as to what this style of music looks and sounds like.
Ocean.
Ready? Dripping the sauce, outlet, yeah. Strips, yeah, look, dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste. Dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste. Dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste. Dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste. Talking my name, man get smoked. Batting, yeah, she keeps calling my phone. Trying to get these racks out, leave me alone. Trying to take trips out Barcelona. And you know, man, I spit that smoke. And you know, man, I stepped in sauce. Man just hating how I flex. Like shit, now ain't my fault. Big Oaks, score that one-line play. Audi whizzing, looking on cold. Studio 808, that's my settings. 24 hours, I'm in my zone. Club got me feeling like Cade. You got me feeling like Cade. Watch no dig man, cause I got my Air Force Ones. All my bros, yeah, we looking all trendy. Jim the goals, yeah, that's set already. That's a sweet one on my right, and that's Lizzie on my lefty. That's fresh trim, man, I got patterns. Sauce can spill, every man step. How can a gal be brewed and feisty? Looking like Shaun of the Dead, man, I keep beefing. He ain't stepping correct. Crazy my Air Force Ones. Yeah, I'm kinda vexed. I managed to a couple else, so I come again. I'm trying to get this profit. See design in my closet. Trying to do mumsy shopping. Give it all, yeah, that's promise. I'm a mug, you man, stop it. Man, the IS something like toxic. Got shooters black like Gotham. I'm broke with a pack and he's chopping. And Amsterdam was headed loud like shit, yeah, I got man coughing. Yeah, I know she wants my babies. Cause I'm ever so wavy. Cause I'm hiding my pagans. They just acting all shady. Stack and save that Mercedes. If I had that, she would crave me. My cousin moving so flaky. That shit don't faze me. Trying to see tens with O's. Trying to do beach, not roast. I'm in Bristol, I'm not broke. Man, I stepped in looking like whoa. Man, I stepped in looking all show. You man stepped in looking all broke. I ain't saying that I'm rich. I don't mean to boast. Dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste. Dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste. Dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste. Dripping in sauce, I'll let it rain. Trying to fly to a tropical place. Ain't got no time like Flavor Flav. Life is sweet, need a different taste.
Alright, great. So with that example, you can see the kind of UK landscape and hear the accent and everything like that. If you're interested in hearing more in terms of grime music, you can just check out like the Wikipedia page. There's a lot of artists listed there, and you can hear too in other songs there might be like more emphasis on like a dance hall backing beat or something like that. So yeah. To understand this specific manifestation of hip-hop culture in the UK, the two researchers conducted a multi-sited ethnography in London and Bristol. So usually ethnographies are conducted in a single place. So if we think back to Ju Young Lee's ethnography of the rap battles in South Central LA, he continued to go to one open mic repeatedly. In this study, the researchers tended to kind of go back to a handful of different places, but because they weren't going back to a singular space, they weren't able to kind of get the same rich ethnographic details that you would from a single-sided ethnography, but they were able to speak to this concept using this data. This data is probably more appropriate to speak to a concept that looks at things that happen across space, right, rather than in just one space. So, you know, weaknesses aside in terms of ethnographic data, their study does help us to understand what this translocality looks like in a smaller region than, say, the entire world. And so their big contribution to this concept is to talk about a translocal subjectivity. This does relate back to the kind of global hip-hop culture that exists, but it is really valuable to narrow down to just this kind of UK level translocal subjectivity by studying grime music. So what this concept helps us to see is that if you want, in establishing this hip-hop culture in the UK, you know, a UK-based hip-hop culture, that doesn't mean that still means that the people who are part of that culture need to distinguish themselves from other people in the UK, whether they're in London or Bristol or some other sort of neighborhood, right? So because they can connect on this subjectivity, you know, there's kind of like a group membership that that spans beyond any particular city, but is still based on these kind of symbolic markers, which show people who live in UK and are part of the grime scene, and those who live in the UK and maybe just know about it or are not a part of it at all. Okay, so before moving on from this article, I want to just draw your attention to 3 parts of the article that help us to kind of think through themes from other weeks. The first one has to do with the role of music videos in establishing this translocal subjectivity that the grime artists were a part of or had themselves. So you remember the story of seeing the young men at the youth center. They see that this other group released a music video that specifically called them out in terms of their neighborhood, and they had to figure out a way to respond in a way that felt appropriate to them, right? And I think that was really interesting, and how they kind of changed the goalposts or the scope of the debate, saying this isn't a feud between neighborhoods, I'm trying to rep the UK, right, which was sort of basically the message, but they replied through their music video as well, and so both of these can be kind of seen as maybe a microcosm of of what Trisha Rose would call black noise, but maybe in the UK we didn't get a ton of the demographic information of the people who were participating, but it's still this sort of noisiness which was represented in the music, so maybe we can just call it grime noise or something. But I think that that's really worth noting in extending the insights that we had from last week, in that hip-hop culture was able to spread through the globe because of the music video format. The authors say that the music video helps you to kind of see the aesthetic without necessarily needing to understand every single word that the MC is saying, or even understand, say, the different musical traditions that they're drawing on to make the backing track. And so I think that that's an important aspect of, or the authors show how that's an important aspect of hip-hop's global spread. But in this article, it helps us to see how culture can spread in a more specific regional sense. So it's kind of 2 ways of looking at the same sort of phenomenon, right? Just at 2 different scopes. And I hope that you kind of spend time thinking about how translocality works at these different, like I was just saying, scope, but you could say a unit of sociological analysis, right? Bramwell and Butterworth are talking about how translocality works in the UK. They mostly focus on these 2 cities, but they're talking about how this spreads across a general region. Whereas the other authors we were reading last week were talking about how translocality helps us to understand hip-hop as a global culture. So those music videos, I think, are really important. I think I'd like to also point out how in this study they show how the musical form was intimately intertwined with the politics of the place, right? They use that example of the grime scene kind of rallying behind one particular politician and having a specific tagline. They called it the Grime for Corbyn movement. If you want to take a little double check that, I believe that's on page 2524. It's a lot of pages in that journal. So yes, how music videos are important, how this music fits into the political context of the region, and I think, I guess I could have connected this with the music video thing, but how this friendly competition of hip-hop culture is really manifested in the grime scene as well. So whether or not you see grime as a subgenre of hip-hop, I realize that this is a bit of a point of debate, but either way, it shares a lot of similarities in terms of how the culture operates, how you achieve recognition in the grime scene as well as in the hip-hop scene, and how this music gets interconnected with the local politics. So yes, I hope that this article helped you to kind of see this huge global phenomenon we've been talking about, that we were talking about last week, on a kind of more intuitive scale, perhaps, or a scale that's maybe easier to picture. Yeah, so I hope that that's really helpful for you. And yeah, and I guess the last thing, sorry, that I forgot to mention here is that in that aspect of the friendly competition and the hip-hop culture too, we can see that there's another important aspect of hip-hop culture, which is that bad man archetype. So in the example of the white artist who did another thing which, you know, repeats in this class, which was decentering his race and centering his, like, badassness, right? Like, he drew specific connections with, like, a UK mobster, and postured in that sort of violent way. So relating that back to what we were talking about last week in terms of the bad man archetype, or in terms of the article that we read by Jeff Harkness and Gibson about how white people, or even just non-black people, can claim authenticity in a hip-hop scene by decentering their race and centering something else that's valued in hip-hop culture that they can claim more easily, right? Like a white person can't, well, they can, but it's harder for a white person to claim to be, you know, of a different racial background than to kind of posture and be and act confident, to kind of fall in line with that bad man archetype. Great. So I hope that I really just wanted to draw out the connections to other themes and topics that we've covered throughout the class here, to show how this study is actually really insightful, to kind of draw those things together and to help to see this bigger social phenomenon on a smaller scale so that it's a little more manageable. All right, so turning to the second article for today's course will be another reading by Oware, who we read earlier in this semester. Here's another content analysis of his, which takes a bit of a different approach. So the kind of beginning question that Oware poses in this article is, are there differences in the thematic content of underground rap and mainstream rap? The basic idea behind this is that you expect there to be a difference between mainstream rap and underground rap. So can we find that empirically, right? And he uses the content analysis method to do that. So I hope that, you know, these are the kinds of questions that you can kind of pose and have the tools to answer for yourself now. So I hope that you can kind of see that when you're reading through this article. I want to start off by talking about the difference between mainstream culture and underground culture, or what Bourdieu might call pure culture. So I'm just going to review kind of the basic theoretical underpinning that Oware is using in this article, which is Bourdieu's field theory. But I'll go over it just in case you're still confused about it, but I do want to emphasize that in this class you're not being evaluated on how well you can understand and use Bourdieu's theories. So if this is a bit over your head or doesn't interest you, that's totally fine. We're not going to be... you're not going to be evaluated on your understanding of Bourdieu. But the basic idea is that we have two kind of tendencies in cultural fields. So cultural fields are the social systems that make the culture that we produce. Bourdieu would say that we have one system that works for the kind of like marketable culture, and then we have another system that exists for the kind of non-marketable culture. And so he says that like mainstream culture works in the same way that sort of like economic world works, right? Like there's high demand for something, and so it's mass produced and sold all over the place or whatever. But he says that we think about art as something which is the economic world reversed. So the pieces of art that make the least amount of money are the least profitable. Those are the real forms of art. So you can think of somebody like Vincent van Gogh, right, who never saw any sort of success in his lifetime. He's kind of the archetype of this, struggling artist who becomes, what like Bourdieu would use the word consecrated, but basically like he becomes a holy figure in art once he's dead, and he never saw any of that success in his lifetime. And so Bourdieu would kind of talk about that as if it's like the pure form of art versus the more mainstream form of art, which could be, like anything that's on the top 40. So, yeah. In Bourdieu's model, like all of that to say is that in Bourdieu's model, he says that these are two drastically different things and they operate on totally different kind of logics, right? Oware advances, based on his data, that these fields aren't mutually exclusive, and actually to succeed in this restricted field of production, which is the economic world reversed, or the underground. There's all of these different words that we can use for it, but basically where art for art's sake is valued. So Oware says that to be popular in the field where art for art's sake is valued actually works the same way, or very similar in the way that people are valued in the mainstream market in hip-hop, right? So like the hip-hop for hip-hop's sake artists who are really successful are actually doing stuff that's pretty similar to the kind of commercial hip-hop artists. So we'll get into that with more depth here. So let's talk about the data set for a second. So he collects hip-hop songs. It's a bit complicated. It's not really that necessary, but he ends up getting 318 underground hip-hop songs from a variety of years, and he collects those and then conducts this content analysis on them. The way that he does that is kind of interesting, where he uses what a statistician might call like a dummy variable. So if a song has something in it at all, some of his codes that he uses are like homophobic attitudes or anti-corporatist attitudes. So if any song had that at all, he would code that as 1, and then if it didn't have it, it would be 0. So you can do this kind of funky math. Again, you don't need to understand this, but he was doing basically statistics with these songs by coding whether or not one of these 5 themes appeared. We're going to talk about the limitations of his method closer to the end, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there to introduce what it is that he found once he analyzed these kind of popular underground hip-hop songs. So he says, you would expect these hip-hop songs to center political messages more often, and perhaps even kind of anti-corporate messages than their mainstream counterparts. In the article, he doesn't directly compare. He doesn't say okay, I've got these 300 underground songs and I've got these 300 mainstream songs. He's kind of saying all of these other researchers have done stuff on mainstream songs, so we know what those look like. Conceivably, underground songs should look different in the sense that they should be more overtly political. Perhaps there's going to be a bit less misogyny if they're going to try to take a different tack than mainstream artists. But what he finds is that the popular underground artists that he studies basically replicate what's going on in the mainstream market for hip-hop. So I'll pull up the table that he has here. So you'll see that he has these 5 themes, which may or may not have appeared in the songs. Political, anti-corporate, misogyny, violence and hypermasculinity, and homophobia. I think that it's interesting that he parsed these 3 themes out: the violence, hypermasculinity, homophobia, misogyny, sexism, themes. But, these could be all kind of grouped together into hypermasculinity, right? All of these kind of follow follow through with what we've learned is hypermasculinity throughout this class in terms of braggadocio, violent posturing, misogyny, and sexism. And I think that this article is the first time that introduces the relevance of kind of homophobia to this in this theme. It maybe has come up a little bit in the readings, but not so directly. And I think that that's an important aspect of hypermasculinity in terms of how it operates. It not only frames women in a certain way, but it frames, good and bad men in a certain way. And to be kind of like in the not ideal category of a man in hip-hop culture would be to be effeminate, or, gay. This is like a problem for the general, this kind of stereotypical idea of, I guess, a straight black hip-hop artist. So, what's surprising about the sample averages at the bottom here is that the counts for hypermasculinity, sexism, and homophobia, especially misogyny and hypermasculinity, these are, above 50%, and that's generally what mainstream hip-hop looks like. We were expecting to see a bit more political attitude and a bit more anti-corporate attitude, perhaps even eclipsing some of the misogyny and hypermasculinity here. But it turns out that it doesn't really come close. One thing I think is worth mentioning here is that you might not expect a lot of anti-corporate themes in these underground hip-hop songs because they're not on corporate labels. So what are they rallying against? So you might see it a little bit, but I can see how you might be able to explain that one away. In terms of the political attitudes, that one is the most political messages. That's the most surprising, because you would expect hip-hop artists who are unencumbered by the commercial system of hip-hop to be able to voice these political sentiments more explicitly, more frequently. And Oware finds that that is not the case. Great. Okay, so yeah, just before moving on, there's the point I wanted to bring up, which I neglected to. In this example of homophobia, because this is a new theme that we haven't really gone through yet, you can see here that one of the artists that is selected is MF Doom. And just to kind of get a sense, I'm not going to play it just because I don't think it's worth it, but if you're interested in hearing homophobia, like an instance of very clear homophobia in hip-hop culture, MF Doom has a track on that album that's called Born This Way, and the track is called Baddie Boys. So I would suggest to check that out if you're interested. If not, I'm not going to put it in the lecture so that we can move on. Okay, so moving towards the one more kind of conceptual point I want to make before discussing Oware's methods for this empirical research article has to do with that concept of accommodationist politics. So I don't think Oware mentions that explicitly in this article, but remember back last week when we were talking about, how can somebody like Nicki Minaj achieve such high levels of success is by kind of performing these accommodationist politics in her music and music videos. So what that means is that there might be some political messaging there, but it's kind of overshadowed by other things that people can accept more easily. So in the case of this underground hip-hop, even if, say, like, let's just say the political messages that do appear are extremely more radical, right? In this analysis, this is a very quantitative analysis. We're not getting a sense as to, like, what are all these political attitudes that are making up that 18%? How radical are these attitudes compared to the political forms of resistance that are expressed in, say, mainstream culture? There could be an important difference there, but we don't have much to go on. So I think it's just worth noting then for this article that we can talk about accommodationist politics that way, because whether or not the political messages that are expressed in these songs are more radical or not than mainstream hip-hop, they are eclipsed by the general issues, the problematic themes of mainstream hip hop. Right. Let me just say that again. So, the political messages of underground hip hop, whether or not they're radical or not, or more radical than mainstream hip hop, they're overshadowed by problematic aspects of hip hop culture, namely misogyny and hypermasculinity, which again kind of manifest in instances of sexist language or aggressively over the top kind of violent language. Before moving on from this article, I do want to just kind of note kind of an issue I see with the claims that Oware is making and the data that he's using to do it. I think that the point about accommodationist politics stands, but I think that it's worth noting that if you want to say something about underground hip-hop, by studying the most popular forms of underground hip-hop, you're not really accessing the thing that you're talking about, right? He's not adequately critiquing Bourdieu from my point of view, because he's not actually accessing the space of hip-hop for hip-hop's sake. All of these hip-hop artists are very commercially successful. They produce a product which can be commercially successful, whether or not it becomes that or not. But you can imagine that maybe the real underground hip-hop, which does kind of follow the themes that you would expect in terms of not being extremely misogynist and sexist and hyper-masculinity and having like really consistently presented political messages, maybe you would have to go to a live space for that. Maybe it's a bit more ephemeral than a studio recording. So that said, I find a bit of a problem with him saying that these two cultures are symbiotic, right? He's saying that as underground hip-hop artists become more popular, they come to resemble more of the mainstream artists. But he's not really saying, like, I don't think he's he's measuring successful underground hip-hop artists by the amount of money that they make. That is the exact same standard of evaluation for mainstream artists. So, Bourdieu says the cultural field, say that the pure or restricted cultural field operates like the economic world reversed. Well, if you're going to judge people in that world based on standards of the economic world, then you're not really working from the same premise. Again, I just want to point that out, that there are kind of strengths and weaknesses and points of flaws that can be pointed out in these data sets that help us to understand hip-hop culture. Nonetheless, I think the kind of big takeaway is still incredibly relevant, that hip-hop artists that are valued kind of outside of the mainstream market, so, I'm more familiar with like MF Doom or the People Under the Stairs here, but I'm sure you can think of other artists that have been important in your life, or maybe some of these other ones are sticking out to you. But I think that does play an important role, that even though there's artists that we consider kind of outside of the mainstream, they are the kind of means of achieving popularity have to do with practicing this sort of accommodationist politics. And that, again, like most things that we talk about, goes back to the commercial interests in the culture industries and the profitability of hip-hop culture. Great. So that's going to be the end for the Oware article. And now we'll move on to the final article for this class. I'm very sad to have to move on to this one, but we'll move on to it now. And yeah. On here. Alright, so before we get into that last reading, I do just want to talk about a concept that's really important to understanding what they're doing in this reading. So, like I was kind of foreshadowing last week, what this article does is helps us to see how hip-hop culture fits within the cultural classification systems of multiple societies. So, this is building off of the insight of things that were going on last week. Again, remember the story of the core 4 elements of hip-hop being adopted at different rates, with different intensities, in different countries around the world. In non-English speaking countries, they found graffiti and dance. They were drawn to that, more easily because, they understood it's not a language barrier that prevents you from understanding how to do it and what's impressive about it. Whereas in English-speaking countries, there could have been some adoption of graffiti and dance and DJing, but MCing was really took off. So this last article, it doesn't talk a whole lot about hip-hop. It does categorize a lot of different things, including R&B and hip-hop, into this like black music category. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but this is what's interesting about taking this sort of approach, is that you can see how hip-hop culture fits within a society, in terms of like how much it's valued, what other things it's associated with. So cultural objects is what we're talking about. Cultural objects here. So these are any tangible manifestation of culture. So that could be Born Like This by MF Doom, Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, or just like a hamburger. All of those are cultural objects, right? Like these are manifestations of culture in a tangible form. And these cultural objects are divided up in the heads and habits of consumers. If you go further into the sociology of culture, you'll read more by that author. His name is Paul DiMaggio, and he's a really excellent sociology of culture scholar, but that's his kind of quote about how cultural objects are organized. They're organized in the way that we think and the way that we act. So, for example, we can think about like how closely different forms of culture are related, So when I say hip hop and baseball, you might be like, what? But if I say hip hop and basketball, you're like, oh, okay, those fit together, right? Like these are things, they're very different cultural forms, but they have these associations in our mind. Sociologists like to talk about how cultural classification systems help us to understand social systems in terms of, say, socioeconomic background. So that's kind of the classic thing that you can see here. So we can pull out just like a quick example of this chart that I have here. I believe this was published by Time magazine in like the 50s or 60s. But I think the kind of generic kind of patterns that they're presenting to us are still intuitive to us today. So you can see here at the bottom we have lowbrow tastes. So you can see the difference between furniture and food and drinks and music and reading here, as well as like causes that they want to back. So I don't know, a pretty simple example here is like the difference between the lowbrow drink is beer, the lower middlebrow drink is like bourbon and ginger ale, and then there's a dry martini as an upper middlebrow, and then I like how they put the kind of like phraseology that these like the ideal kind of highbrow person you would imagine would say, like a glass of adequate little red wine. Like it's probably like a $300 bottle of wine. It's like it's adequate. And yeah, you can see this through the salad thing too. Like this is a very kind of complicated-ish salad, an unwashed salad bowl. I have no idea what that is and why that's important. And then like kind of the same things here. Quartered iceberg lettuce, store-bought dressing is like the lower middle brow, and then coleslaw is low brow. So these are kind of arbitrary, but I hope you can kind of see what's going on. Is that these cultural systems map onto our social systems. Sometimes they're more or less complex. In a society that's very rigidly hierarchical, these cultural classification systems might be very distinct. And in societies with a bit more, say, social mobility, or more kind of populism, in the article they talk about how the U.S. is a generally populist society, and so they don't care so much about the distinctions between highbrow and lowbrow culture. another kind of explanation could be that they make a lot of the lowbrow culture, and so they have a kind of economic incentive to play down the distinctions between highbrow and lowbrow culture. Okay, so I think that that's an adequate setup for just kind of understanding this idea of these concepts of cultural objects and the cultural classification systems that the cultural objects are in. Another quick thing I just want to note too is that this changes over time. It's like I was saying, it's like more or less rigid depending on the society, but no matter the society, these are always changing. You know, we can think about as technology advances, something that was, you know, very only accessible to highbrow audiences with lots of money, can become cheaper and cheaper and more accessible to people in lower socioeconomic brackets. And then the highbrow people will move on from that one once the people in lower classes have adopted it. So again, yes, these are more or less rigid and they change at various rates, but they're always changing. Okay, so with that said, let's get into the final article for this class. So we've already talked about the difference between these high, middle, and lowbrow cultural objects, but how do you measure that? Or how do you try to place these objects in an empirically informed way? So the way that these authors approach this problem is by collecting newspapers from different countries, and their research question has to do with this distinction between elite forms of culture or highbrow culture and lowbrow forms of culture, or say popular culture. You know, one clear example of this would be like literary fiction versus comic books, right? Like how much time is devoted in these elite newspapers, which are things like the New York Times, or, you know, things with big reputations that comment on that you know, report and comment on societies. And so kind of the general thesis here is that at the beginning of the period that they're observing, just to kind of simplify things, right, there's going to be a lot more space devoted to literary fiction, and by 2005 there's going to be more space devoted to things like comic books. And then they come up with these hypotheses, right, like what we know about France and Germany and the Netherlands and the US can help to inform us like what we would expect. Okay, so like I was saying, US, generally populist, generally populist kind of culture, has all of the cultural industries there that are producing mass forms of culture at a pretty alarming rate, right? They're saying like, okay, they're going to start introducing popular forms of culture into their elite newspapers earlier on, and ultimately more. Whereas Germany has a kind of societal context of which you would expect it would take them longer to kind of incorporate more popular culture into their elite newspapers versus the elite forms of culture. And so they did generally find those sorts of things. We'll get more into the findings in a minute, but I do just kind of want to talk about their method. This article is very impeccable in terms of its scholarship. They do some really good setups in terms of like, what's our question and why is this important? And then they have this very impressive sampling strategy, and they do this very impressive thing where they literally measure the space in like centimeters square devoted to high culture versus popular culture in these magazines. While this is a huge project, and if you read the paper and noticed that they said that there was like about at least 14 people working on this project, it's huge, right? But I hope that you can see that the assignments that you've completed for this class has introduced you to the skills that this huge team were using to complete this project. Right? So I think that I hope that you do take that away, where it's like, yes, this is like a huge project. It requires so many hours of labor and kind of just cleverness and persistence, right? But I hope that you see that you've had practice with this content analysis method. You know, you could conceivably puzzle through these same sorts of questions for yourself And if you're interested in learning more about that, I hope that you do continue with that. So that said, they collected, and again, I wouldn't, if their sampling strategy was confusing to you, the like stratified, multi-stage, random sampling, you know, you don't need to know the ins and outs of their sampling method. Basically, they sampled in a way that made sure that like the statistics that they generate make sense. But yes, this isn't going to be an important aspect for this course, but they conducted a sampling strategy so that they had what we call a representative sample. So they have fewer instances than all of the instances in the entire world, but enough to be able to run statistical and models on it and to kind of judge the value of the data in like a solid way. So yeah, just to reiterate that, I just want to say that they were conducting content analysis on newspapers. This was very much much of the analysis is quantitative, as you'll see there is a qualitative component to it. But yeah, so they were able to kind of take this huge data set and show this kind of empirically demonstrate a pattern that you would kind of expect, and then to also kind of think through the puzzling aspects of the puzzling aspects of what their data was telling them. So generally, like I was saying, the general finding is that all of these newspapers allowed mainstream popular forms of culture to take up more space. There were predictable differences between the US and Germany, but they show that overall these papers attention to popular forms of arts and culture did grow in them. I think something else just something worth noting here, that they say there is a sharp change in around 1995 when they talk about that the paper started to incorporate an actual arts and culture section. I don't know, I found that surprising. I don't know about you, but I always thought arts and culture sections were just something that always existed. Like some other things in this class that we've talked about where it's like, oh, that just hasn't always existed. But yeah, so I found that to be sort of interesting. Because that's something that we're used to now. So yes, I think that these are the two, that's the first kind of general finding, is that all of the newspapers began to feature popular forms of culture more over the period that they observed, so from 1955 to 2005. Something else that's really interesting in their analysis is that they found no significant difference between the newspapers at the beginning and at the end. So I can see how that might be a bit confusing, but what that is saying is that even though all of the newspapers featured popular culture more at the end of the period that they observed all of these things, all four of the newspapers basically stayed in the same relation to each other. So that means that even though they featured more, each magazine featured more coverage of popular culture, they all feature about the same relative to one another. So, you know, when they were saying like, you know, Germany is going to be the most stingy about this, the US is going to be the most open about this, that was true in 1995, it was true in 2005. So I did find that pretty interesting. I hope that you saw that there. Alright, so just before we get into what these findings tell us about popular music, and more specifically how hip-hop music fits into these cultural classification systems of these four different countries, I think it's worth saying that the two general findings that I just covered, that there was more coverage of mainstream and popular forms of culture in these magazines, or sorry, in these newspapers, and that the newspapers actually maintained the same positions, or like the same types of cultural classification systems relative to each other throughout the whole period. Both of these findings help us to see how in all four of the societies, their cultural classification systems became more open So the boundary between high culture and popular culture became a bit more flexible, right? And so this is more true for some countries than others, but it is true for all four of them. The implication of this, so there isn't like a clear kind of causal relationship here, but the authors explain this as an effect and causing more omnivorous tastes. So I just want to talk about this a little bit. This isn't really that important for knowing about, like for the sociological insights about hip hop that I want you to take away from this course. But if you do kind of continue into sociology classes, or perhaps another sociology degree that kind of deals with cultural sociology, it's worth kind of understanding what this omnivorousness concept is. The basic premise is that in societies with more rigid, class hierarchies and systems of cultural classification, people have cultural tastes that match their social position, right? So that's kind of just like the idealized form of that relationship, right, between economic position and cultural tastes. Because of this democratization process of cultural classification systems and the devoted kind of like that these elite newspapers and other kind of gatekeepers are taking popular culture more seriously, it shows that people's tastes aren't, there isn't a one-to-one relationship between like, I'm in this social position and so I like this type of culture, right? What we're kind of finding now is that people who are at the top of the, say, economic hierarchy, their cultural tastes aren't just like classical music and opera and really fancy wine, like they like everything. The secret is knowing when it's appropriate to have, I think that's the kind of thing. It's like this omnivorousness has to do with this flexibility of knowing when it's appropriate to like eat a hamburger and when it's appropriate to have a classy glass of wine, or like both how to act at a dingy grunge bar as well as at a high class Italian restaurant, right? Like that's the omnivorous consumer. They know how to consume forms of culture from across that brow line, I guess you could say. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that before we get into the stuff that Janssen, Verboord, and Kuipers talk about in terms of popular music, and then especially when they mention hip-hop as a kind of smaller section of what they're analyzing as black music. But yeah, so I just wanted to kind of cover that so that you're not confused by a lot of the stuff that they were saying when they were like, okay, there's like changing educational things and these omnivorous tastes or whatever. So I just wanted to explain that and to reiterate that omnivorism and consumer taste, that kind of concept, isn't the important takeaway for this, right? Like that's not going to appear on the test for the class, but I did want to just kind of convey that for you in case you were curious. Okay, so I want to switch over to the actual article here because there's this table which I think tells a pretty interesting story. Okay, so you can see here, Table 6, distribution of selected subgenres within popular music. Okay, and so we got the 4 countries, plus the total. And if we go to the total, we can see, coverage of black cultural form, like black music. So like a cultural form associated with black people, which is black music, which was at varying times R&B, like literally it was called race records, maybe around 1995. Basically when an artist was black, they would go onto the race records charts, and then white artists could be on like the pop music or whatever. So yes, anyway, to go back to this, you can see here that, it's relatively low, grows a little bit, shrinks a little bit, grows a little bit. And then you can, like, just before we get to the States, because I think that's kind of interesting and surprising, is that, yeah, you can see it's kind of like generally growing. I guess, yeah, this is an interesting outlier here in Germany, 1975. That might have been... yeah, it's hard to say what that is. I'm not sure if they say that in the article. But you can see, like, generally these European countries, it kind of grows over the period of when hip-hop comes into existence. I'm honestly not sure what's going on here. I'd be curious. But I think that, look at what's going on in the US here. I think that this is really strange. That it started off pretty high, went a bit lower, and then dropped in 1995. I don't know, what do you think would explain that? My initial thought is that, you know, here in 1955, black music, that's associated with R&B and is generally not political, right? I believe it was the first lecture for this class, we were talking about Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come, which I believe was published around that time. That was the first explicitly political hip-hop, or sorry, not hip-hop, that was the first explicitly political R&B song that, like, made it on the Billboard charts, right? So my thought here about this decline, especially the decline in 1995, and then the huge growth that you can see by 2005, is that this really had to do with the hip-hop wars, the 1995 measurement. You know, I think that probably, you know, these elite newspapers probably covered controversies and things like that that were, like, related to the hip-hop wars that were going on at the time, but they weren't treating the music seriously as a cultural art form. You know, they were treating the controversy seriously, but they weren't treating the culture seriously. This is just a hypothesis, but I think that that could make sense as to, like, why it was actually so low once hip-hop was pretty popular in the US in 1995, and then how it grew by a crazy amount by 2005. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that in terms of the story that this article can tell us about how a black cultural form traversed its way across the globe. Again, we don't have specific things about hip-hop here because they've kind of collapsed them into a different genre for their own purposes, but we can kind of see how hip-hop is definitely implicated in that, especially in the measurements after 1975. And with that, we are at the end of this course content. So, if you've made it this far, thank you for sticking around. I hope that you have taken away some insights which you can apply to your own hip-hop consumption, as well as just your understanding of music genres and cultural forms around the world, how these can be infused with both messages of resistance and over-the-top sexism. It can have messages of racial inequality, but still somehow manage to perpetuate racist attitudes. These are conversations and debates that have been happening since the beginning of popular music. So, to end this class, I want to bring us back to a time before hip-hop began. Like I mentioned in the first lecture and just a little bit ago, Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come really helped to establish a political attitude in mainstream music. But it also tells us a lot about the tensions that people like him have to navigate in even proposing to put a political message in their music. All of this is wrapped up in our cultural industries and the audiences who consume the culture that gets produced. So if you haven't seen it yet, I would suggest to check out the whole film, but I will just... So I'm going to throw over to a clip from the movie One Night in Miami. It's an imagined conversation between Malcolm X, Jim Brown, Sam Cooke, and Muhammad Ali. At that time he was known as Cassius Clay, so you'll hear characters refer to him as Cass or Cassius. And in the scene, like the clip that I've selected here, it revolves around a conversation about how much political effectiveness somebody like Sam Cooke can have for, in this case, it's like the African American community leading up to the Civil Rights era or during the Civil Rights era. I was going to say leading up to the post-Civil Rights era, which we've talked about a lot in this class. But yeah, so it presents an imagined conversation there. It could be real. I don't know how veracious this film, which before was a play, I believe, depicts the conversation that they had. But you will see there, and if you check out the rest of the movie, just these repetitive themes of trying to voice resistance, trying to survive, trying to assert some sort of cultural independence, and also finding that you're dependent on these dominant forms of culture that surround you. So again, thank you for sticking around throughout this whole class. It's been a pleasure to help to introduce you to the sociological perspective on hip-hop. I hope that this inspires you to continue to think about how society shapes the cultural forms that surround us. And yeah, if you're interested in learning more about cultural sociology, I'm happy to talk to you more about that. If you're interested in doing any more reading in the hip-hop of culture, I would thoroughly suggest, here, let me just pull them up here. This one and, So, book by Michael Eric Dyson, on Jay-Z. It's a really excellent book. Talks about kind of the sociological implications of his rise, and his impact on hip-hop culture. And then, of course, Blown Up by Ju Young Lee. Some of you have already looked through this book, but it's really excellent if you would like a book-length read in the sociology of culture. Those are in the sociology of hip-hop. Those are two really excellent options. So with that, I will throw over to the final clip for the class, and then we'll come back and I'll say a little bit about the final exam.
Hey, you should consider coming as well, Sam. Leaving this country in the rear view for a while is a great way to get some perspective.
I'm busy, too.
One can never be too busy for some added perspective.
I'm swamped, man. And I gotta prep to go back to the Copa.
Oh, come on, man. You need to go on and forget about the Copa.
It's not that bad.
Come on, man.
All right, fine. Maybe it was that bad.
You don't shuck and jive enough for those old tastes.
I may not dance around the stage like Jackie or James Brown, but that's not what I'm selling, all right? I'm selling my voice, my words, my image, my message.
A message? The problem is at the Copa, you have to sell that message to a bunch of white folks.
That don't matter. They got souls, don't they? And every living thing with a soul can have that soul tapped into. I thought you'd know that.
You think just maybe your energy's misdirected, Sam, trying to tap into white people's souls?
No, I don't. If I win them over playing our music, I'm knocking down doors for everybody. You watch and see. It's not going to always be the pop charts over here, black music charts over there. One day it's going to be one chart. One music for all people.
What kind of message are you sending, though, by doing one show for white folks and a completely different show for black folks, Sam? No, listen to me. You performing in places where the only black people not on stage are the ones serving the food.
Don't you think I know that? Can't tell you how many times I wanted to reach out and punch somebody.
Then strike with the weapon that you have, man, your voice. Black people, we standing up. We speaking out. Sam, you have possibly one of the most effective, beautiful outlets of us all. You're not using it to help the cause, bro.
Hell, I'm not. I got the masters to my songs. I started a label. I'm producing tons of black artists. Don't you think my determining my creative and business destiny is every bit as inspiring to people as you standing up on a podium trying to piss them off? Oh, wait a minute, I forgot. That's all you do.
Sam, I do plenty.
Oh, do you? Let's see. You suck at sports.
Well, I was never much into
can't
football.
Can't sing. Damn sure can't make shit out of no peanut.
Is there a point to this rant,
My point is
Sam?
that sometimes I feel like you just like all the rest of them people out there, obsessed with the stars.
Oh, no, Kenneth.
Look around.
Let him
Look
finish.
around. Which one of us don't belong?
Don't belong.
Don't belong.
Brother Sam, the only person here white people seem to like, that would be you.
Hey, y'all need to cool it now, man.
You know, you always manage to just be around for shit, haven't you? Maybe your daddy should have beaten you better.
Jimmy, I'm gonna kick this motherfucking ass.
Let him go.
Everything all right, Brother Malcolm?
All right, so the final thing that you'll have to do for this class is the exam, or the final assessment. So the way that this will work, similar to the early assessment, it will be available at noon on April 19th, and then you'll have 72 hours to complete it. So you need to submit it by April 21st at 12 p.m. The test is worth 30% of your grade. I've designed it to be kind of similar to other final exams and like other courses. So, you should expect to put aside, 2 to 3 hours to complete the assessment. But again, you have the 72 hours to complete it. If, you've got other exams that are happening at the same time, feel free to let me know and we can make accommodations for that. But if you're wondering about the shape of the assessment, there's 3 parts. The first part is going to be multiple choice questions. So each of these will be kind of like out of 0.25. These are going to be cumulative. They'll cover the things in the recent weeks as well as some things in earlier weeks. So make sure to have your notes in order for those. The second and third parts are mostly focused on the readings and concepts that we covered in the later half of the course, so things after the authenticity week, though that doesn't mean that core concepts from earlier on in the class won't be important for you, so make sure that you're brushed up on those. Something that you can just start to think about now is potential sociological research questions about hip-hop you would be curious to answer. So like, what are the kinds of questions that you think should be answered from a sociological perspective? What's the kind of method that you think would be the best way of going about answering that? So I'd suggest to kind of think about that a little bit. That might be helpful going into the exam. Again, next week I'm going to be posting a review. So I'm not exactly sure what this is going to look like. I might just make a supercut of some of the most important stuff that we've talked about in lecture, or I am totally happy to record some more video lectures for us if you would find that useful. So I will open it up to you to please post something in the Quarkus discussion board for this week. If there's a particular concept that is still confusing you or something else that you'd like to go over, perhaps find another example. If there's anything too that you would just are curious about, like there's these 2 concepts and they seem pretty similar. What's really different about them? I'm happy to cover stuff like that just to help you with your understanding of the course material as we go into that final exam. So yes, just to reiterate that, please post any questions or concepts that you would like to get more clarity on. If you can just kind of give me a sense as to what's still confusing you about these, that would be really helpful, just because if it's I don't understand black noise, explain that again, I'll just be go watch the lecture again. But if it's I don't understand XYZ components, then I can definitely talk about that. So more specificity will be helpful if you're looking for that kind of advice. Yeah, and if there's not a lot of engagement there, that's totally fine. I will just kind of make a post. I will clip together the previous lectures to kind of highlight some of the important things that you might want to make sure to brush up on before the exam. All right, and so with that said, I want to thank you again for sticking around throughout this whole class. I hope that you're leaving feeling like you understand hip-hop a bit more, and I hope that you have, I hope this has been a supplementary benefit, but have developed an extra appreciation for hip-hop culture and hip-hop music, and perhaps even some curiosity about how it works on the social level. So with that, I will leave it to you to let me know if there's anything you would like me to talk about next week. If not, I will be posting a review as I normally would on Tuesdays. All right, so take care and good luck.